What do wow to with a story that refuses to stay in its proper century? Across the world, in temples worn by sand, in caves sealed by salt, in monasteries hidden above the clouds, human beings have left behind a strange kind of testimony. Not simply prayers, not only myths, but scenes, moments, descriptions of light so intense it changed the land, of objects in the sky that move with purpose, of sounds that shattered stone, of visitors or forces that seemed to arrive from somewhere beyond the familiar order of nature. For generations, most of these accounts have been placed in a safe category: symbol, allegory, religious imagination, and often that may be true. Ancient people spoke through metaphor because metaphor was one of the few bridges they had between experience and understanding. Yet some passages do not behave like metaphor. They linger with the texture of observation. They name heat, vibration, ash, silence, sickness, fear. They describe what happened to rivers, to animals, to the body. They read at times less like invention than like memory struggling to survive inside poetry. This is where our journey begins, not with a claim and not with a verdict, only with a question. What if a few of the oldest stories on Earth were trying to preserve encounters their authors could not explain? What if myth, in certain moments, became a shelter for difficult truth? And what if the distance between legend and history is not a wall but a veil? The chapters ahead move through India, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Mediterranean, Tibet, the Americas, China, and the far north. Different languages, different gods, different worlds, different, yet a similar unease appears again and again. Something came, something happened, and those who saw it were never entirely able to forget. Perhaps these are only echoes shaped by time. Perhaps they are fragments of real events transformed by centuries of retelling. Or perhaps they reveal something even more intimate about us, that human beings have always sensed how little of reality belongs to certainty. And so we begin where all enduring mysteries begin, with witness, with wonder, and with the fragile courage to remember. What if the oldest battlefield in memory was lit by a weapon no age should have known? Imagine dawn over Kurukshetra. Dust hangs above the plain. Horses tremble in harness. Metal catches the first weak light of morning. Men stand with bows, spears, and prayers, believing the day ahead will be brutal in the familiar human way. Then something changes. Not strategy, not courage, something in the air itself. The old Sanskrit epic remembers a single force released into that world, and the language surrounding it is hard to forget. A brightness beyond comparison. Heat that seemed to erase distance. A burst so overwhelming that the battlefield stopped being a battlefield and became an afterimage burned into cultural memory. The descriptions do not linger on triumph. They linger on consequence. Blinding light, scorched ground, waters disturbed, creatures falling where they stood. For centuries, readers have approached these lines as mythic exaggeration, the natural poetry of an epic built on bis, vows, and destiny. That is a reasonable reading. Ancient literature often enlarges reality to make moral and spiritual truth visible. But there are moments in this account that feel less symbolic than observational, as though language itself were straining to name something unbearable. The text does not merely celebrate power, it recoils from it, and that recoil matters. It suggests memory rather than fantasy, human witness rather than pure invention. Somewhere beneath the grand architecture of legend, there may be the outline of a real catastrophe, whether natural, human, or something no longer easy to classify. The event survives because it wounded more than bodies. It wounded understanding. That may be why the scene still feels modern, not because it proves an impossible theory, but because it preserves a timeless fear. That knowledge can outrun wisdom, and that one moment of brilliance can leave generations standing in its shadow. So the question is not only what the poets saw, it is why they chose to remember it as warning instead of wonder. It started perhaps with a city and a sky that no longer looked trustworthy. In the old stories of the Eastern Mediterranean, destruction does not always arrive as an army at the gate. Sometimes it comes as weather that feels almost intentional, as fire falling from above, as smoke rising so thick it turns daylight into morning. The account is brief, almost severe in its restraint, and that restraint is part of what gives it power. There is no delight in ruin, only astonishment, and a lingering sense that the world itself had briefly become hostile. For many readers, this has long been understood as sacred judgment expressed through narrative. Others have wondered whether the memory could preserve some distant natural disaster. A meteor airburst, an earthquake releasing fire, bitumen igniting, a chain of events that ancient witnesses could only describe with the language they had. We cannot know with certainty. The distance is too great, the evidence too incomplete, but the emotional truth of the story survives regardless of interpretation. People saw something they could not fit inside ordinary experience. What remains striking is the human scale of the memory. Not kingdoms, not empires. One family told to leave, one glance backward, one landscape transformed into a place future generations would approach with caution and story. The catastrophe becomes intimate. It enters the body. It enters grief. It becomes the kind of event that is retold at night, not because anyone fully understands it, but because no one can bear to let it vanish. This is how history often survives before it becomes history, not as data, but as warning, not as analysis, but as image. Smoke on the horizon, salt in the wind, a silence after noise so immense that people begin to hear meaning inside it. And maybe that is the deeper mystery. When the earth convulses or the sky burns, human beings do what they have always done. We gather the fragments into a story, hoping that if we can name the terror, we might also inherit a little wisdom from it. What if the strangest machine in the ancient world was not built to change the future, but to make peace with the sky? At the bottom of the sea, among broken statues and the remains of a shipwreck, divers found something that looked almost accidental. Corroded bronze, fragments fused by salt in time. At first glance, it seemed like debris, one more ruin claimed by the Mediterranean. But as scholars began to study it, teeth emerged from the corrosion, wheels, ratios, layers of intention. Inside that green and crumbling mass was a mind-made metal. What we now call the Antikythera mechanism does not belong comfortably to the story most of us tell about antiquity. We imagine the ancient world in marble and parchment, in philosophy and war. We do not expect precision gearing capable of tracking celestial cycles with astonishing sophistication. Yet here it was, a device that transformed the heavens into motion a person could hold in the hand. Not magic, not myth. Engineering of a very high order, born in an age we often underestimate. And still, the machine feels mysterious, not because it proves some lost super civilization, but because it reveals how much knowledge can vanish. A tradition of craftsmanship flourished, achieved something extraordinary, and then fell into silence. Whether through conquest, decay, accident, or simple historical drift, the chain was broken. What survived was not the world that made the mechanism, only a damaged echo of its intelligence. There is something haunting in that. We like to imagine progress as a straight road, each century adding to the one before it. But history is less orderly than that. Sometimes wisdom is accumulated. Sometimes it is scattered. Sometimes people learn how to read the dance of the planets with brass and mathematics, and later generations are left staring at the fragments, trying to reconstruct not just the object, but the confidence behind it. The mechanism reminds us that mystery is not only found in what ancient people could not explain, it also lives in what they understood so well that we forgot they ever knew it at all. In the Egyptian night, the sky was never empty. It was a script of motion, a theater of recurrence, a place where order revealed itself through stars and seasons. But every so often, the heavens seemed to break character. One ancient Egyptian text, often discussed with caution and fascination, describes unusual forms appearing above the land, objects or lights unlike anything expected in the known rhythm of the sky. The language is old, filtered through copies, fragments, and debates over translation. Some scholars see symbolism, a ceremonial description, or later embellishment. Others hear in it the tremor of witness, a record shaped by reverence and confusion. As with so many ancient accounts, certainty remains just out of reach. What matters is not the temptation to force a modern explanation onto an ancient page. It is the mood the account preserves. The watchers are not indifferent. They look upward with alarm, curiosity, and the instinctive awareness that something unusual has interrupted the familiar order. The sky, which usually offered pattern, becomes an event. And when pattern breaks, meaning rushes in, that impulse is deeply human. Across civilizations, people have turned to the heavens not only for navigation, calendars, or religious reassurance, but for proportion. The sky tells us where we are. It tells us that morning follows night, that winter yields, that there is structure larger than fear. So when something appears that seems to ignore the expected choreography, it unsettles more than the eye. It unsettles trust. Perhaps the ancient scribes were recording a rare atmospheric phenomenon, a comet, an astronomical event, or a story ritualized through time. Perhaps they were preserving a courtly memory whose original details are lost to us now. Either way, the account survives because someone believed the interruption mattered. And that may be the real legacy of such texts. They remind us that wonder is not always gentle. Sometimes it arrives as a disturbance, as a question hanging over a kingdom, asking what we are supposed to do when the world keeps its shape, but not its certainty. What if the oldest map of the universe was also a confession of how little we truly see? In ancient Mesopotamia, priests climbed temple towers and studied the sky with patient devotion. Night after night, they recorded eclipses, wandering stars, strange lights, and the subtle behavior of seasons. To them, the heavens were not empty distance. They were alive with meaning, a vast written surface where power, fate, and natural order seemed to meet. But among these careful observations, there are passages that feel unsettled, as though the sky occasionally presented something that would not fit the categories available to it. Babylonian and Assyrian records speak in the disciplined language of omen texts and astronomical notes. Yet behind that discipline, there is often unease. A star appears where none should be. A glow hangs in the darkness. A form crosses the heavens and is preserved not with poetry alone, but with the calm seriousness of administration. To modern eyes, these may describe planets, meteors, comets, auroras, or atmospheric effects. That is often the most grounded path. And still, the emotional tone in some of these records suggests more than routine observation. It suggests interruption. That tension is important. Mesopotamian scholars were not naive dreamers staring upward in superstition. They were among the earliest systematic readers of the sky, people who built knowledge through repetition, pattern, and memory. When they marked something as unusual, it carried weight, not because they possessed modern science, but because they knew the ordinary heavens intimately enough to recognize when the ordinary had been disturbed. What survives in those clay tablets is not a solved mystery, but something more enduring, evidence of disciplined wonder. Human beings at the dawn of recorded history were already doing what we still do now, watching carefully, naming imperfectly, and trying to decide whether an anomaly is a message, a mistake, or a doorway into deeper understanding. Perhaps that is why their voices still feel close to us. Across thousands of years, the question remains the same. When the universe shows us something unfamiliar, are we seeing a sign, or simply the edge of our own vocabulary? High in the Himalayan imagination, where air thins and silence feels almost physical, stories were born that seemed to hover between meditation and encounter. Tibetan texts and oral traditions speak of luminous beings, sky travelers, and realms that could be entered not by distance alone, but by transformation of mind. To modern ears, such accounts can sound purely spiritual, and in many ways they are. They belong to a culture where the boundary between the visible world and the interior one was never drawn as sharply as it is in the modern West. Vision, revelation, and geography were not always separate categories. A mountain could be a place and a symbol at once. And yet some passages remain stubbornly vivid. They describe movement across the sky, radiant forms, sounds without visible source, or visitors associated with knowledge that seem to come from beyond the ordinary human order. The language is devotional but not always abstract. There are details of brightness, direction, shape, and sensation that make these narratives feel strangely immediate, as though they're trying to anchor an inner event in the language of external experience. That ambiguity is not a flaw. It may be the point. In these accounts, mystery does not arrive only as something outside us, like a comet or a storm. It also arises through consciousness itself. The unknown is not merely out there in the distance, it is woven into perception, memory, discipline, and belief. The witness is part of the event. For a modern audience, there is a temptation either to literalize everything or dismiss it all as mystical metaphor. But the deeper value of these traditions may lie elsewhere. They remind us that human beings have long understood reality as layered, with some truths measured by instruments and others encountered in altered states of attention, devotion, or awe. So the question these stories leave behind is not simply whether something appeared in the sky. It is whether our idea of evidence is wide enough to honor how profoundly the human mind participates in what it sees, fears, and calls sacred. It began with a sound no one could place, not thunder, not wind, something nearer to metal or stone under impossible pressure. In the old records and legends of China, the sky is often treated as a moral and cosmic mirror. Comets, eclipses, unusual stars, and sudden lights were not merely observed. They were interpreted, woven into a worldview where heaven and earth answered one another. Court astronomers watched carefully because anomaly mattered. A shift in the sky could signal political change, natural imbalance, or a disturbance in the hidden architecture of things. Yet among these reports are moments that still feel oddly intimate, almost eyewitness in their texture. There are descriptions of fiery objects crossing the heavens, luminous forms descending, sounds accompanying light, and events that startled entire communities into record. Some may have been meteors, some perhaps atmospheric phenomena, rare alignments, or misunderstood celestial events. The sober answer is often the best one. But what makes these accounts endure is not the temptation to make them modern. It is the seriousness with which they were preserved. These were not casual tales told only for wonder. They were entered into chronicles, discussed by officials, and framed as part of the relationship between human order and the larger universe. That tells us something important. Ancient observers did not treat the unknown as entertainment. They treated it as responsibility. If the sky behaved strangely, someone had to notice. Someone had to remember. There is a quiet dignity in that. In our own time, flooded with images and explanations, mystery is often consumed quickly and forgotten. But the chroniclers of old China wrote as if attention itself were a moral act. To observe carefully was to honor both the world and the fragile place of human beings within it. And perhaps that is why these stories still resonate. They ask us to consider whether the strange thing in the sky matters less for what it was and more for the kind of people we become when we decide not to look away. On the other side of the world, where stone cities rose from jungle, mountain, and desert, memory often traveled through image before it traveled through text. Among the Maya, the Aztec, and other civilizations of the Americas, the heavens were not distant decoration. They were calendar, prophecy, agriculture, ceremony, and power. Temples aligned with stars. Ritual life moved in rhythm with celestial recurrence. The sky was read with sophistication, precision, and reverence. Yet within that disciplined relationship to the cosmos, there also survive stories of descending fire, radiant visitors, and events that seem to join heaven and earth in sudden, unsettling ways. As always, caution matters. These traditions come to us through fragile channels, codices that survive destruction, colonial retellings, oral memories, carved imagery, and interpretations shaped by translation. It is easy to impose modern fantasies on them, just as it is easy to flatten them into simple myth. The truth is more demanding. These cultures possessed rich symbolic languages in which arms, stars, rulers, and natural forces could overlap. A figure descending from the sky may be cosmological, historical, ceremonial, or all three at once. But that complexity does not make the accounts less meaningful. It makes them more human. People were trying to preserve the felt reality of extraordinary experience using the tools their culture gave them: image, ritual, story, monument. A blazing object in the heavens, a visitation associated with knowledge, a sign read as both wonder and warning. These become part of communal memory, not because they are solved, but because they change the emotional weather of a people. There is something poignant in that continuity. Across continents that never shared language or empire, human beings kept turning upward and finding both guidance and disturbance. The sky fed crops, ordered rituals, and marked time. But every so often it also broke its own pattern, leaving behind stories that lived longer than certainty. Maybe that is why these traditions endure. They remind us that civilization is not built only from what we can explain. It is also built from what we choose to remember when explanation fails. What if the oldest warning from the sky was not a prophecy, but a witness statement? In ancient China, history was often written with the care of a gardener tending fragile roots. Dynasties, floods, eclipses, harvests, and omens were all preserved because memory itself was considered a form of order. So when an old chronicle pauses its usual rhythm to describe something violent descending from the heavens, the effect is startling. The tone changes. Ceremony falls away. What remains is event. The account speaks of fire arriving from above with a roar that turned daylight strange. Something bright, metallic, and fast tore through the clouds and struck the earth with such force that the land blackened around it. Mountains split, the air filled with ash. And then, in the most unsettling detail of all, there is the suggestion that something emerged from the burning aftermath. Not a god in triumph, not a spirit in metaphor, but a silent figure no one dared approach. It is easy and often wise to begin with natural explanations. A meteor, a rare impact, an atmospheric event transformed by time into legend. Ancient witnesses did not have modern scientific language, and they reached for the words available to them. Yet the restraint of the record is what keeps drawing people back. It does not sound eager to persuade. It sounds eager to preserve. That difference matters. The passage reads less like invention than like a memory carried forward because no one present knew how to live comfortably with what they had seen. The event entered folklore, then caution, then place itself. Stories of a pale visitor, of damaged ground, of animals avoiding the region, of instruments losing their trust and direction. Over centuries, the landscape became not just land, but testimony. Perhaps this was a catastrophe of nature remembered with human fear. Perhaps it was something stranger. But either way, the old Chinese record leaves us with a question that has followed every civilization that ever looked up in wonder. When fire falls from the sky, are we witnessing destruction alone, or contact with the limits of what we think the world can contain? Far to the north, where winter can erase the line between earth and sky, memory survives in a different register. It is carried not only in books, but in breath, in firelight, in stories told when darkness presses close against the walls. Among northern and Arctic traditions, there are accounts of lights that moved with intention, voices in the air, and presences associated with the sky that did not behave like ordinary weather. Today we might think first of auroras, and often we should. The polar heavens are capable of astonishing displays, curtains of color, shifting forms, sudden brightness that can make the whole world feel alive. For communities who lived with such skies, wonder was part of survival. But there are also tales that seem to go beyond the familiar beauty of the northern lights. They speak of objects, of beings, of sounds that inspired not celebration, but caution. In many of these traditions, the unknown was never treated lightly. A strange light was not just an image, it was a presence to be respected. Children were warned, hunters paid attention. Entire communities learned which places felt wrong after certain events, which nights seemed to carry a different kind of silence. The stories are rich in symbolism, but they are also grounded in close observation. People who survive in severe landscapes become experts in normality. They know the sound of wind over ice, the behavior of animals, the character of familiar light. When something stood apart from that order, it was noticed. That may be why these northern accounts feel so intimate. They do not present mystery as spectacle. They present it as relationship. Human beings sharing space with forces they cannot name, learning to respond with humility rather than mastery. And maybe that is the lesson hidden inside the cold. Not every unknown thing demands conquest or explanation on our schedule. Some mysteries endure because they ask first for respect, reminding us that understanding begins not in certainty, but in the discipline of attention. It started with a pattern too persistent to ignore. Across continents that never shared language, scripture, or empire, the same images return with quiet insistence. A sudden brilliance in the sky, a sound without clear source, heat, ash, trembling ground. figures or forces descending from above, witnesses reaching for sacred language, not because they intended to deceive, but because ordinary speech was too small for what they felt had happened. By now, the question is no longer about any single text. It is about the echo between them. Of course, similarity does not prove a common cause. Human beings everywhere watch the same sky, fear the same storms, and build stories from the same emotional materials. Awe, grief, wonder, confusion. Lightning can become divinity. A comet can become warning. A rare atmospheric event can enter legend and live there for centuries. The responsible path is to keep those explanations close. But responsibility also asks us to notice when repetition itself becomes meaningful. Why do so many old traditions preserve not only celestial marvels, but the same emotional sequence? First disruption, then interpretation, then memory shaped into ritual, caution, or sacred text. It is as if cultures separated by oceans all arrived at a similar human conclusion. When reality exceeds comprehension, the event does not disappear. It changes form. It becomes story, and story is not the enemy of truth. Often it is how truth survives before better language exists. A poem may carry the emotional accuracy of catastrophe long after its physical details blur. A myth may preserve the silhouette of an encounter history can no longer verify. What remains is not perfect evidence, but durable human response. That may be the real discovery here. The ancient world was not united by secret knowledge, but by vulnerability. Different peoples stood beneath the same unknown and tried, with the tools available to them, to make meaning without claiming mastery. In that sense, these mysterious texts are less about what visited humanity than about what humanity becomes when certainty breaks. Watchful, imaginative, afraid, and profoundly unwilling to let wonder die in silence. And so we arrive at the edge where explanation becomes philosophy. By this point, the old accounts have taken us through battlefields, deserts, temple archives, mountain visions, court chronicles, and polar nights. We have seen how ancient people described light that wounded, machines that outlived their makers, skies that broke pattern, and events so unusual they were carried forward in prayer, fear, and song. Some of these mysteries may one day yield to better archaeology, sharper translation, or clearer scientific context. Others may remain unresolved, not because they are supernatural, but because time is ruthless with evidence. That uncertainty can be frustrating. We are modern people. We want causes, categories, conclusions. We want the strange object named, the event dated, the witness verified. But the past rarely offers itself in that tidy form. Instead, it gives us fragments, shards of text, damaged inscriptions, retold memories, symbols half understood. And from those fragments, we try to rebuild not only what happened, but what it felt like to stand there when the ordinary world suddenly failed to explain itself. Perhaps that is why these stories endure. They are not only records of anomaly, they are records of humility. In each case, human beings encountered something larger than their available knowledge and chose, despite fear and confusion, to preserve the encounter rather than erase it. They admitted the limit, they wrote anyway. There is quiet courage in that gesture. To say, in effect, we did not understand this, but it mattered. We leave it to the future. And now the future is us. The question is no longer whether we can solve every ancient mystery. The deeper question is how we receive what has been handed down. With arrogance forcing certainty where none exists, with credulity turning every gap into fantasy, or with the harder discipline of thoughtful wonder. Because in the end, the unknown is not a failure of knowledge. It is part of knowledge. It is the horizon that keeps human curiosity alive, calling us forward not with answers alone, but with the dignity of better questions. In the end, perhaps the most enduring mystery is not what ancient people saw, but why they worked so hard to remember it. Civilizations rose, flourished, and disappeared. Libraries burned, empires collapsed, languages fractured into silence. And still, across the broken bridge of time, certain images kept returning. A sky opening in fire, a sound that seemed to come from nowhere, a machine too subtle for the age we assign to it, a figure or force standing at the edge of explanation. These memories survive conquest, erosion, translation, and disbelief. That alone tells us something. Human beings protect what wounds them, what astonishes them, and what refuses to fit neatly into the world they thought they knew. Maybe some of these stories preserve natural disasters later wrapped in sacred language. Maybe some reflect symbolic truths expressed through mythic form. Maybe a few still contain kernels of experience that remain difficult for us to classify. We do not need to pretend certainty in order to feel their power. In fact, their power may come from the opposite. They remind us that the search for understanding has always been unfinished. That unfinished quality is not a weakness in the human story. It is one of its deepest strengths. We are creatures who inherit fragments and still try to build meaning. We read damaged text. We study corroded metal. We compare distant traditions. We listen for resonance between cultures that never met. And in doing so, we reveal something profound about ourselves. Not simply that we want answers, but that we are shaped by the act of asking. So perhaps these ancient mysteries do not ask us to believe in hidden worlds or lost powers. Perhaps they ask something gentler and more difficult: to remain awake, to accept that history is not only a record of what was known, but of what was felt at the border of the unknown, to honor both science and imagination, evidence and humility, fact and wonder. And maybe that is the final lesson carried forward through all these old voices. The universe has always been larger than our explanations, but so too is the human capacity to witness, to remember, and to keep searching for truth with open eyes.